The winds of Aegis 12 screamed like mourning spirits as they tore across the barren expanse of the planet. Red sands rose in swirling eddies, painting the horizon in hues of blood and rust. Above, a sickly amber sky hung heavy, eternally locked in a state of oppressive twilight. The desolation of the land seemed infinite, broken only by the silhouette of a rusting cage perched on the edge of a crumbling plateau. Inside the cage, Nyrella remained still. Her orange skin, once glowing like molten fire under the light of her homeworld's twin suns, had faded to a pale, lifeless hue. She sat hunched, her body weak and emaciated, her long limbs trembling under the weight of her own exhaustion. Her hair, a cascade of coppery strands dulled by grime, clung to her face. Her golden eyes, faintly glowing, stared out toward the empty horizon, not with hope, but with resignation. She had lost count of the days since her captors had left her here, abandoning her to the unforgiving elements of this forgotten world. Hunger hollowed her body, thirst burned her throat, and the chilling wind gnawed at her exposed skin. Her once proud posture a hallmark of her people, the Arenthi, known for their grace and strength, had crumbled under the weight of despair. Nyrella's mind drifted, retreating into fractured memories to escape the present. She had been a scientist, a keeper of knowledge, tasked with protecting her people's most sacred discovery, the luminal codex, a relic of immense power capable of harnessing the energy of stars. The Arenthi had believed it to be a gift, a tool to heal worlds and sustain peace, but others had seen it as a weapon. The Syndicate of Dominus, a ruthless coalition of interstellar factions, had waged a brutal campaign to claim the codex. Nyrella, falsely accused of espionage, became a scapegoat. To discredit her people and silence her knowledge, they had branded her a traitor and sentenced her to a slow, agonizing death on Aegis 12. A sudden sound jolted her from her reverie, a low, mechanical hum. Her gaze snapped upward, scanning the horizon. A ship streaked with soot and scars from countless battles pierced the sky. Its descent was clumsy, buffeted by the planet's turbulent winds, but it continued its approach. Nyrella stiffened, her frail body tensing. Ships rarely came here. Those that did were scavengers, mercenaries, or worse. Her fingers brushed against a sharp fragment of bone on the cage floor, a relic of some predator that had died long before her arrival. She clenched it tightly, her knuckles whitening against her sunken skin. If they had come to finish her, she would fight. Even in her weakened state, she would not go quietly. The ship landed with a heavy thud, kicking up a cloud of crimson dust. Its ramp lowered, and a lone figure emerged, silhouetted against the dying light of the alien sun. He moved with purpose, his steps steady but cautious. His attire, a simple yet rugged flight jacket and utility pants, marked him as a pilot or perhaps a salvager. A blaster hung at his hip, but his hand stayed far from it as he surveyed the area. Eli Drake squinted against the swirling dust, scanning his surroundings. The signal he'd picked up had been faint, almost imperceptible. He hadn't expected much, perhaps a malfunctioning beacon or remnants of some long-abandoned tech. What he hadn't expected was this: a cage, rusted and weather-beaten, and the figure inside it. "What the hell?" he muttered under his breath. As he stepped closer, the figure came into focus. She was alien, no doubt about it. Her luminous orange skin, elongated limbs, and faintly glowing eyes were unlike anything he had ever seen. But it wasn't her alien features that struck him most. It was her condition. She looked like death itself, her body emaciated, her hair matted, her lips cracked and dry. The sight ignited a spark of anger deep in his chest. "Who did this to you?" he asked aloud, though he knew she wouldn't understand. His voice, rough yet steady, carried over the wind. Nyrella's eyes narrowed as she clutched the bone fragment tighter. The man's voice was low, resonant, but she couldn't discern his intent. Friend or foe, it didn't matter. She had no reason to trust him. Her glowing eyes locked onto his, a silent challenge. Eli stopped a few feet from the cage, raising his hand slowly in a gesture of peace. "Easy," he said, keeping his tone calm. "I'm not here to hurt you." He pulled a canteen from his belt and unscrewed the cap. Tilting it to his lips, he took a small sip, then extended it toward her. The act was simple, but deliberate, a gesture of goodwill. Nirella's eyes flicked to the canteen, then back to him. Her throat burned at the mere sight of the water, but she didn't move. Was this another cruelty, another ploy? Her instincts screamed to stay back. "I know you're scared," Eli said softly, crouching to her level. "But you need this more than I do." Still, she hesitated. The syndicate had taught her to expect deception, to fear even the smallest kindness. But the man didn't push. He placed the canteen on the ground and stepped back, his hands still raised. Tentatively, Nirella reached out. Her fingers trembled as they closed around the canteen. She brought it to her lips and drank. The water, though lukewarm, was life itself. She drank until the canteen was empty, then lowered it, her breathing ragged. Eli watched her, his heart heavy. He had seen suffering before on war-torn planets, in refugee camps, but this was something else. This was deliberate, calculated cruelty. Whoever had left her here had wanted her to suffer. "I'm getting you out of there," he said, pulling a small cutting tool from his belt. The device hummed to life, casting a blue glow as it sliced through the rusted bars. Nirella flinched at the sound, her grip tightening on the bone fragment. As the bars fell away one by one, she didn't move. Even when the cage was open, she remained frozen, her eyes darting between Eli and the desolate landscape. Eli extended a hand toward her. "You're free," he said. "Let's get you out of this place." Nirella stared at his hand, her glowing eyes flickering with uncertainty. Slowly, painfully, she shifted forward. She ignored his hand, crawling past him on her own. Her body, frail and trembling, collapsed onto the rocky ground outside the cage. Eli knelt beside her, pulling a thin thermal blanket from his pack and draping it over her shoulders. Her body stiffened at his touch but didn't pull away. "You're safe now," he said, though he wasn't sure she believed him. Hell, he wasn't sure he believed it himself. He lifted her gently, cradling her in his arms as he carried her toward the ship. She didn't resist. She was too weak, too broken to fight anymore. As the ramp closed behind them, the winds of Aegis 12 carried the cage's hollow rattle into the distance. The plateau stood empty, the sky a bruised canvas of amber and crimson. For the first time in years, the cage was silent. The hum of the ship's engines reverberated through the dimly lit cabin as Eli Drake guided it away from Aegis 12's atmosphere. Outside the cockpit's reinforced window, the planet shrank into a crimson orb, its hostile terrain soon obscured by the darkness of space. Eli exhaled, his hands steady on the controls, but his mind anything but calm. He glanced toward the back of the ship, where his unexpected passenger rested on a padded bench. Nirella lay draped in a thermal blanket, her body still, her breathing shallow but steady. The ship's internal lights gave her orange skin a muted glow, highlighting the sunken contours of her cheeks and the faint shimmer of her golden eyes, which remained half-closed. Even in this state, her alien features possessed an undeniable elegance, though Eli saw only fragility. Eli turned his attention back to the controls, setting a course toward a neutral outpost several light-years away. It was the closest place he could think of where they might find medical supplies and answers. He tapped the console, inputting coordinates, but his mind wandered. "Who are you?" he muttered, more to himself than to her. In the back, Nirella stirred. The vibration of the ship felt strange, foreign. She opened her eyes, blinking against the low light. The cold metal of the bench pressed against her back, and the unfamiliar hum of technology surrounded her. Panic bubbled up before she remembered the man, the one who had freed her from the cage. Her fingers tightened around the edges of the blanket as she tried to push herself upright, her limbs trembling under the effort. Eli heard the faint rustle and turned, his chair swiveling toward her. "Hey, take it easy," he said, his voice softer now. He rose from his seat and approached her, keeping his movements unhurried. "You're safe here." Nirella's gaze snapped to him, wary and guarded. She pulled the blanket tighter around herself, her golden eyes narrowing. She understood none of his words, but his tone carried no hostility. Still, her instincts screamed at her to remain vigilant. Trust had been a weapon used against her before. Eli crouched a few feet away, keeping his hands visible. "Can you understand me?" he asked, gesturing toward himself, then toward her. Nirella tilted her head, her coppery hair falling across her face. The language barrier was a chasm between them, but his gestures were clear. She hesitated, then shook her head faintly. Eli sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Figures," he muttered. He stood and moved to a nearby compartment, pulling out a med kit. "Let's see if we can at least patch you up." Nyrella watched him with the intensity of a cornered animal, her muscles tense despite her exhaustion. When Eli returned with the kit, she flinched as he knelt beside her. He paused, holding the kit in one hand and raising the other in a placating gesture. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, his voice calm and deliberate. He opened the kit, showing her the contents: sterile wraps, a small scanner, a vial of antiseptic. He pointed to her arm, where a jagged wound ran down her forearm, crusted with dried blood. Nyrella glanced at the wound, then back at him. After a moment's hesitation, she extended her arm, though her posture remained tense. Eli nodded, working quickly but carefully. The antiseptic stung and she hissed, pulling her arm back slightly. He paused, meeting her gaze. "Sorry," he said. "It's this or an infection." She didn't understand his words, but his steady expression and lack of aggression calmed her. She nodded faintly, allowing him to continue. The care he took with each movement surprised her. It was a stark contrast to the cruelty she had endured before. As Eli worked, his mind raced. She wasn't just another alien refugee or scavenger. Her features, her condition, and the advanced craftsmanship of the cage all hinted at something bigger. Whoever had left her to die on Aegis 12 had gone to great lengths to ensure no one found her alive. "You're not ordinary," Eli muttered as he wrapped her arm in a thin, flexible bandage. He sat back on his heels, studying her. "What's your story?" Nyrella stared at him, her expression unreadable. She didn't respond, not because she couldn't, but because she chose not to. Her trust was not easily given, and this man, though kinder than most, was still an unknown variable. Eli sighed and stood, returning the med kit to its compartment. "All right," he said. "You don't have to talk, but if we're going to make it out of this, I need to know who's after you." The ship's internal lights flickered briefly as a low beeping sounded from the cockpit. Eli's head snapped toward the console. A proximity alert. He moved quickly to the controls, his expression hardening as he scanned the radar. A ship, a sleek, predatory model, was closing in fast. "Damn it," Eli muttered. He recognized the design immediately. Syndicate hunters. He turned to Nyrella, who had stiffened at the sound of the alarm. Her golden eyes locked onto his, and for the first time, he saw fear, not the guarded defiance from earlier, but genuine terror. Whoever these people were, she knew them, and she knew them, and she knew what they were capable of. "Looks like you've got some dangerous friends," Eli said, strapping himself into the pilot's chair. He hit several switches, powering up the ship's defensive systems. "Hang on. This could get rough." Nyrella braced herself against the bench as the ship lurched forward, its engines roaring to life. The Syndicate ship closed the gap, firing a volley of plasma rounds that narrowly missed Eli's freighter. The cabin shook, and Nyrella let out a sharp cry, clutching the sides of the bench. "Hold it together," Eli shouted over the noise. He banked hard to the left, weaving through the asteroid field that loomed ahead. The Syndicate ship followed, its weapons lighting up the darkness of space. Eli gritted his teeth, pushing the freighter to its limits. The ship groaned under the strain, but he managed to stay ahead of their pursuers. He activated the rear turret, firing blindly in their direction. The shots missed, but it was enough to force the enemy ship to swerve, buying them precious seconds. Nyrella clung to the bench, her eyes wide as the ship twisted and turned. Her mind raced, memories of her people's starships and their elegant maneuvers flashing before her. Despite her fear, she pointed toward the cockpit console, her expression urgent. Eli glanced back at her. "What? What do you want me to?" She gestured more emphatically, her hands mimicking a movement pattern. Eli frowned, then followed her gaze to the control panel. He understood. Barely. "You're saying, use the asteroid field?" he asked. Nyrella nodded, her expression resolute. Eli didn't have time to question her logic. He pushed the throttle, diving deeper into the asteroid field. Massive rocks hurtled past, their surfaces jagged and unyielding. The Syndicate ship hesitated, its pilot wary of the narrow gaps and unpredictable trajectories. Eli smirked, his confidence returning. "Smart move," he muttered, angling the ship through the chaos. The Syndicate ship faltered, unable to match his risky maneuvers. A final burst from the turret clipped their engine, sending them spinning into the void. Eli let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The ship stabilized, and the radar screen cleared. They were alone again. He turned to Nyrella, who slumped back against the bench, her body trembling, but her eyes still burning with determination. "I don't know who you are," Eli said, his tone softer now, "but I'm starting to think you're more than just some prisoner." Nyrella didn't respond, but the faintest flicker of a smile touched her lips before exhaustion pulled her into unconsciousness. Eli watched her for a moment, then returned to the controls, setting a course for the neutral outpost. One thing was clear: this woman's story was far from over, and he was now part of it, whether he liked it or not. The freighter's engines roared as it plunged through hyperspace, cutting a path through the infinite darkness. Streaks of light flashed across the cockpit windows like distant ghosts, a constant reminder of the fragile bubble that separated the ship from the deadly vacuum of space. Eli Drake leaned back in his pilot's chair, his hands steady on the controls, but his thoughts restless. The events of the past hours replayed in his mind like a broken transmission. The woman he had rescued, Nyrella, though he still didn't know her name, lay in the ship's cramped sleeping quarters. Her orange skin glowed faintly in the low light, the bioluminescence dimmer than it should have been, as if her body were conserving its last reserves of energy. She was an enigma alien, vulnerable, yet fiercely resilient, and now, because of her, they were being hunted by one of the most ruthless factions in the galaxy. Eli's fingers tapped rhythmically on the armrest. "Why did I get myself into this?" he muttered. He knew the answer. He couldn't leave her to die. Not like that. Not in that cage. A sharp beep from the console jolted him out of his thoughts. The proximity alert flashed red, and Eli's heart sank. He reached for the controls, his jaw tightening as he scanned the radar. A single ship was closing in fast, its design sleek and predatory. "Damn it," he hissed under his breath. In the sleeping quarters, Nyrella stirred. The faint vibration of the freighter shifting its trajectory woke her, and her golden eyes blinked open. She sat up slowly, her body still weak but her senses sharpening. She felt the subtle change in the ship's movement and the rising tension in the air. Something was wrong. Pulling the thermal blanket tighter around her shoulders, she made her way toward the cockpit. Her steps were unsteady, but determination burned in her gaze. When she entered, she found Eli hunched over the controls, his posture rigid. His face, illuminated by the glow of the console, was a mask of focus and frustration. "What is it?" she asked instinctively, her voice melodic but foreign to him. Eli glanced over his shoulder, momentarily startled by her presence. He gestured toward the radar display, where a glowing dot was rapidly closing the distance. "We've got company. Syndicate, if I had to guess." Nyrella's expression hardened. She didn't need to understand his words to grasp the gravity of the situation. Her people had known the Syndicate's cruelty well. The scars they left weren't just physical, they burned across star systems, carving fear and devastation in their wake. The pursuing ship fired a warning shot, a bolt of plasma streaking past the freighter's hull. The impact rocked the ship, and alarms blared in the cockpit. Eli tightened his grip on the controls, gritting his teeth as he threw the freighter into a sharp, evasive maneuver. "Hold on," he barked, though he wasn't sure if Nyrella understood. She grabbed the back of his chair for support as the ship veered violently. The view outside became a chaotic blur of stars and light as Eli pushed the freighter to its limits. The Syndicate ship fired again, this time clipping the freighter's starboard side. Sparks erupted from a nearby console, and the cabin filled with the acrid smell of burning circuitry. Eli cursed under his breath. Shields are barely holding. This bucket wasn't built for combat. Nyrella's gaze darted to the array of controls and displays. Though the technology was unfamiliar, she recognized enough to act. She pointed to a panel near Eli's left hand and spoke urgently in her language. "What?" he asked, glancing at her in confusion. She gestured again, this time mimicking the motion of flipping a switch. Her eyes were alight with determination, their glow intensifying. Eli hesitated, then followed her instruction, activating the ship's auxiliary power. The engines surged with renewed strength, and the freighter shot forward, momentarily widening the gap between them and their pursuers. "Not bad," Eli admitted, glancing at her with a flicker of admiration. "You know your way around a ship." Nirella didn't respond, her focus entirely on the chase. She moved to a nearby console, her fingers brushing over its surface as if trying to decipher its purpose. Eli watched her out of the corner of his eye, both impressed and curious. Whatever her story was, she clearly wasn't just a helpless prisoner. The Syndicate ship adjusted its trajectory, closing in with ruthless precision. Its sleek design allowed it to maneuver effortlessly, weaving through the stars like a predator stalking its prey. A voice crackled through the comm system, cold and authoritative. "Freighter Iron Resolve, this is Commander Vax of the Syndicate. Surrender the asset, and we'll spare your life. Resist, and you'll die screaming." Eli's jaw clenched. He reached for the comm switch and activated it. "Appreciate the offer, Commander, but I'm not in the habit of handing people over to psychopaths." Vax's chuckle was low and menacing. "You're making a mistake, Drake. The Syndicate doesn't forgive, and it never forgets." The transmission cut off, and the Syndicate ship unleashed a barrage of plasma fire. Eli threw the freighter into a roll, narrowly avoiding the shots. The cabin shuddered violently, and warning lights flashed across the console. "Any brilliant ideas?" Eli asked, casting a glance at Nirella. She didn't hesitate. Moving with surprising agility, she pointed to the navigation display, then traced a path with her finger. Her intention was clear: take them into the asteroid field ahead. Eli frowned. "The field's dense. One wrong move, and we're space dust." Nirella's expression didn't waver. She met his gaze, her glowing eyes fierce and resolute. Eli sighed, recognizing the fire in her stare. It was the look of someone who had nothing left to lose. "All right," he said, "but if we survive this, you owe me an explanation." He adjusted the ship's course, steering them toward the jagged expanse of asteroids. The Syndicate ship followed, its pilot clearly confident in their ability to outmaneuver a freighter. Eli smirked to himself. Let's see how cocky they are in there. The asteroid field was a chaotic labyrinth of spinning rocks and debris. Some were small enough to be mistaken for pebbles, while others dwarfed the freighter, their surfaces pockmarked with ancient impacts. Eli guided the ship with practiced skill, weaving through narrow gaps and dodging tumbling boulders. The Syndicate ship hesitated, its larger frame making navigation more difficult. Eli used the opportunity to his advantage, leading them deeper into the field. He activated the freighter's rear turret, firing blind shots that ricocheted off the asteroids. One bolt struck an asteroid's surface, causing it to splinter. The debris forced the Syndicate ship to veer off course, buying them precious seconds. Nirella's sharp eyes scanned the field, her mind racing. She spotted a cluster of tightly packed asteroids ahead and tapped Eli's shoulder, pointing toward it. "You really want me to thread that needle?" he asked, incredulous, but the determination in her gaze left no room for argument. With a deep breath, Eli pushed the freighter toward the cluster, guiding the ship through impossibly narrow gaps. The Syndicate ship followed, but its larger size worked against it. An asteroid clipped one of its wings, sending it into a spin. Eli seized the moment, firing another volley from the turret. The shot struck true, and the Syndicate ship exploded in a fiery burst of light. The freighter emerged from the asteroid field, its hull battered but intact. Eli slumped back in his chair, letting out a shaky breath. He turned to Nirella, who was equally exhausted but visibly relieved. "You're full of surprises," he said, his tone lighter now. Nirella managed a faint smile, the first since he had found her. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind Eli why he had risked everything to save her. For now they were safe, but the journey was far from over. As the freighter drifted into the quiet expanse of space, Eli set a new course. Whatever secrets Nirella carried, he knew they would face the Syndicate again. But for the first time in a long while, he felt something unfamiliar, a spark of hope. The freighter limped through the quiet void, its engines emitting a low, uneven hum. The scars of the chase were visible in the cabin, burnt-out panels, flickering lights, and a persistent vibration that rattled through the walls. Eli Drake sat in the cockpit, his fingers tapping on the console as he recalibrated the ship's systems. His face was grim, his thoughts as turbulent as the damaged vessel. Behind him, Nyrella watched silently, her golden eyes scanning the mess of technology she didn't fully understand. She leaned against the wall, her orange skin glowing faintly in the dim light. Though her body still bore the marks of her ordeal, she stood taller now, her posture less guarded. The spark of resilience in her gaze had begun to return. "You should rest," Eli said without turning, his tone firm but not unkind. Nyrella crossed her arms, tilting her head slightly. She still didn't comprehend his words, but the intent behind them was clear. She shook her head, her coppery hair falling around her face as she stepped closer. Eli sighed and swiveled his chair to face her. "Stubborn, aren't you?" He gestured toward the corridor leading to the sleeping quarters. "If you collapse, you're not doing either of us any good." Nyrella didn't move. Instead, she pointed toward the console, her expression expectant. Eli raised an eyebrow. "You want to help? This isn't exactly beginner-level stuff." She took another step forward, her hand brushing the edge of the control panel. Though the interface was alien to her, the principles behind it felt familiar. Her people's technology had been elegant, intuitive, but grounded in the same universal laws that governed all machines. She touched a blinking indicator, her eyes narrowing as she analyzed the readout. Eli watched, surprised. "You can read that?" he asked, more to himself than to her. Nyrella glanced at him, her expression serious. She pointed to the readout again, then mimicked a motion with her hands, a twisting gesture, as if adjusting something. Eli frowned, following her lead. He opened the corresponding control and found the ship's energy reserves were misaligned, the distribution uneven. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered, quickly making the adjustments. The persistent vibration in the cabin stopped, and the light steadied. He leaned back, crossing his arms. "Looks like you're not just some passenger after all." Nyrella gave a faint smile, the first he had seen from her. It was brief but genuine, a flicker of light in the shadows that had defined their journey so far. The freighter exited hyperspace, emerging into the orbit of a small, uninhabited moon. Its surface was a patchwork of jagged craters and icy plains, shimmering faintly under the light of a distant star. Eli guided the ship toward a flat expanse near the moon's equator, where scattered ruins dotted the landscape. The freighter touched down with a heavy thud, and the engines powered down, leaving the cabin in silence. Eli stood, stretching his sore muscles. "We'll rest here for a bit, make some repairs. This place is as good as any to lay low." Nyrella followed him to the cargo bay, her eyes widening as the ramp descended and the moon's stark beauty came into view. The air outside was cold and still, the horizon stretching endlessly under a pale golden sky. The ruins nearby were ancient, their jagged spires reaching skyward like the bones of some long-dead creature. Eli noticed her gaze and chuckled. "It's not much, but it beats the syndicate breathing down our necks." Nyrella stepped onto the surface, her boots crunching against the icy ground. She approached one of the ruins, her hand brushing against its surface. The material was unfamiliar but carried a strange warmth, as if it remembered the hands that had shaped it. Her people had spoken of places like this, forgotten outposts from civilizations lost to time. Eli joined her, his arms laden with tools and supplies. "We'll need to patch up the hull and realign the stabilizers. Think you're up for it, or are you more of a theory person?" Nyrella shot him a sharp look, her eyes narrowing in playful defiance. She pointed to one of the tools, then to the freighter. Eli grinned. "All right, partner. Let's see what you've got." The hours passed in relative peace, the two of them working in unspoken rhythm. Eli showed her the basics of his equipment, and she adapted quickly, her movements precise and deliberate. Together, they reinforced the freighter's damaged panels, repaired the stabilizers, and replaced a malfunctioning thruster. Though the work was grueling, it carried an unexpected sense of camaraderie. As they finished the final repairs, Eli leaned against the ship, wiping sweat from his brow. "Not bad," he said, glancing at Nyrella. "You might make a decent mechanic yet." She tilted her head, not understanding the words but catching the tone. She gave him a faint nod before returning to the ruins. Something about them called to her, a whisper on the edges of her consciousness. Eli watched her go, his expression thoughtful. "You're not just some scientist, are you?" he murmured. "What are you looking for out here?" Nyrella entered the largest of the ruins, her steps cautious but purposeful. The interior was dark, the walls covered in intricate carvings that glowed faintly under her touch. Symbols and patterns danced beneath her fingers, their meaning just out of reach. She closed her eyes, letting her mind drift, searching for a connection. Suddenly, a low hum filled the air, and the carvings flared to life, bathing the chamber in golden light. Nyrella stepped back, her heart racing. In the center of the room, a pedestal rose from the ground, its surface etched with lines of energy that pulsed in time with her own heartbeat. Eli entered behind her, his hand instinctively going to his blaster. "What the hell is this?" Nyrella didn't answer. She approached the pedestal, her hand trembling as she reached for it. The energy lines shifted, forming a pattern that resembled the star charts of her people's archives. A memory surfaced her people's voices, their songs of the luminal codex, the artifact that could harness the energy of entire stars. She gasped, understanding now why the Syndicate hunted her. She wasn't just a scientist. She was a keeper of secrets they could never have. Eli stepped closer, his voice low. "Whatever this is, it's big, isn't it?" Nyrella turned to him, her expression grave. She placed her hand over her chest, then gestured outward, mimicking an explosion. Her golden eyes burned with urgency. "They want what's in your head," Eli said, piecing it together. "That's why they won't stop." She nodded, her gaze filled with both fear and resolve. Eli exhaled sharply. "Great. So we've got the galaxy's deadliest syndicate chasing us for something that could probably blow up half the universe." Nyrella gave him a questioning look, tilting her head. Eli smirked despite himself. "Don't worry, I'm not running. We'll figure this out." As they left the ruins, the pedestal's glow dimmed, its secrets once again buried in the moon's icy silence. For the first time, Eli and Nyrella walked side by side, not as strangers bound by circumstance, but as allies against the storm gathering in the stars. The freighter drifted in the cold expanse, its engines idling in near silence. From the cockpit, the distant light of a crimson sun painted the ship's interior in faint hues of red and gold. Eli Drake leaned forward in the pilot's chair, his hands gripping the edges of the console. His eyes flicked between the radar and the window, scanning the void for any sign of movement. They had been quiet for too long. Quiet meant trouble. Behind him, Nyrella studied the ruins they had extracted from the moon. The holographic map she had activated earlier now hovered above a makeshift table in the corner of the cabin. Its glowing lines shifted and pulsed, displaying a star chart that stretched across the width of the room. It was beautiful, intricate, and terrifying. The Syndicate would tear apart entire systems to claim it. Eli turned his chair to face her. "We're sitting ducks out here. We need to move." Nyrella didn't look up. Her golden eyes were locked on the hologram, her expression tense. She raised a hand and pointed to one of the coordinates glowing faintly on the map. Then she looked at Eli and tapped her chest, as if to say, "This is the key." "You know where that is?" Eli asked, standing. He crossed the cabin, his gaze following her finger. "What is it?" "Another outpost. A weapon." Nyrella hesitated, her brow furrowing. She touched the hologram again, highlighting a section where the lines converged into a radiant cluster. Her other hand gestured outward, mimicking an explosion, and she pressed her fingers to her temple. Eli exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "Let me guess. It's another piece of this codex thing. And you think the Syndicate doesn't already know about it?" She nodded slowly, her gaze unwavering. Eli cursed under his breath. "Great. So we're heading into the lion's den." They set a course for the coordinates. The journey took them through an asteroid belt, the freighter weaving deftly between the tumbling rocks. Eli kept his focus sharp, his hands steady on the controls, while Nirella monitored the radar. The faint hum of the engines filled the cabin, accompanied by the occasional clatter of debris striking the hull. It wasn't until they emerged from the belt that the first signs of trouble appeared. The radar beeped once, then again, faster and louder. Eli's heart sank as a blip appeared on the screen, followed by another, then two more. He squinted at the horizon, and his stomach twisted. Dark shapes emerged from the void sleek ships, their designs unmistakably Syndicate. "They're here," he said, his voice tight, "and they're not alone." Nirella moved to his side, her eyes narrowing at the approaching vessels. She tapped his arm, then pointed to the holographic map. Her meaning was clear. "We can't turn back." Eli nodded grimly. "We'll have to fight our way through." The Syndicate ships wasted no time. They accelerated, their weapons lighting up the darkness with bursts of plasma. Eli threw the freighter into a sharp dive, narrowly avoiding the first volley. The cabin shuddered violently, the impact of near misses rattling the walls. "Hold on," Eli barked, his voice rising over the noise. Nirella braced herself against the console, her fingers flying across its surface as she activated the freighter's rear turret. The automated gun swiveled and fired, its shots streaking toward the pursuing ships. Two of the Syndicate vessels peeled off, dodging the return fire, while the others pressed the attack. Eli pushed the freighter harder, its engines straining as he maneuvered through the battlefield. He glanced at Nirella, who was focused entirely on the turret's targeting system. Her glowing eyes reflected the light of the console, her expression fierce and determined. "You've done this before, haven't you?" he said, half to himself. Nirella didn't answer, but her movement spoke volumes. The turret's shots grew more precise, forcing the Syndicate ships into evasive maneuvers. One shot struck true, hitting a vessel's engine and sending it spiraling into the void. Just as Eli thought they might gain the upper hand, the radar lit up again. A new blip appeared, larger, faster, and closing in rapidly. His eyes darted to the window, and his blood ran cold. A Syndicate cruiser loomed in the distance, its massive frame bristling with weapons. "Of course," Eli muttered. They brought the big guns. The cruiser opened fire, its plasma cannons sending waves of destructive energy toward the freighter. Eli banked hard, the ship groaning under the strain. Sparks erupted from a nearby panel, and warning lights flared across the console. "We can't take another hit like that," he shouted. Nirella pointed to the holographic map, her expression urgent. She highlighted a nearby star system, then gestured toward the freighter's jump drive. Eli shook his head. "We can't make a blind jump. The drive's barely holding together." Nirella slammed her hand on the console, her frustration evident. She pointed again, her eyes blazing. She wasn't asking, she was demanding. Eli hesitated for a moment, then cursed under his breath. "All right, but if this goes sideways, it's on you." He activated the jump drive, the ship lurching violently as the coordinates locked in. The engines roared to life, and the freighter surged forward, leaving the Syndicate ships and their cruiser behind. When they emerged from hyperspace, the freighter floated into the orbit of a desolate planet. Its surface was barren, covered in jagged rocks and scorched earth. Nirella stared at it, her expression unreadable. She turned to Eli and motioned for him to follow as she made her way to the cargo bay. Inside, she activated a smaller version of the holographic map, overlaying it onto the planet's surface. She traced a path to a specific location, her movements precise. Eli crossed his arms, watching her with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "This is where the codex is, isn't it?" he asked. Nirella nodded, then hesitated. Her hands moved slowly, gesturing in a way that seemed almost apologetic. Eli frowned. "What aren't you telling me?" Before she could respond, a faint beep sounded from the radar. Eli's eyes widened. "They tracked us." Nirella's expression darkened, and she grabbed a nearby pack, slinging it over her shoulder. She pointed to the planet's surface, then to the freighter's landing gear. Eli shook his head. You want to go down there while they're breathing down our necks? Are you crazy? She met his gaze, her golden eyes unwavering. There was no fear, only resolve. Eli sighed heavily. Fine, let's do it your way. But don't expect me to stick around if this goes south. The freighter descended to the planet's surface, landing near the coordinates Nyrella had indicated. The air outside was thin and cold, the sky a swirling mix of ash and light. As they stepped off the ship, Nyrella led the way, her steps sure despite the harsh terrain. Eli followed, his blaster drawn. His eyes scanned the horizon, searching for any sign of the syndicate. This better be worth it, he muttered. They reached the entrance to a cavern, its opening framed by jagged rocks. Nyrella paused, placing her hand against the stone. The air seemed to hum with energy, and the rocks shifted, revealing a hidden passage. Eli raised an eyebrow. That's new. Inside, the cavern was illuminated by a faint, otherworldly glow. The walls were covered in carvings similar to those on the moon, their lines pulsing with light. Nyrella moved with purpose, her fingers brushing against the symbols as if unlocking a memory. At the center of the chamber, a pedestal rose from the ground, its surface etched with intricate patterns. Nyrella approached it, her movements reverent. She placed her hand on the pedestal, and the room filled with a blinding light. Eli shielded his eyes, his heart pounding. When the light faded, Nyrella turned to him, holding a small, crystalline object in her hands. Her expression was calm, but her eyes burned with determination. Before Eli could speak, the ground shook, and the distant roar of engines echoed through the cavern. The syndicate had arrived. Eli clenched his jaw. Guess we'll find out what that thing can do sooner than we thought. The cavern trembled as the distant roar of syndicate engines grew louder, shaking loose small shards of stone from the jagged ceiling. Eli Drake's hand tightened around his blaster, his eyes darting toward the cavern entrance. Shadows danced on the walls, their chaotic movements reflecting the urgency of the moment. Nyrella stood at the center of the chamber, her glowing orange skin casting an ethereal light across the crystalline artifact in her hands. The object pulsed softly, its edges refracting light like a miniature star caught in glass. Whatever it was, it clearly held immense power and immense danger. Nyrella, Eli said, his voice steady but urgent. We've got to move. They'll be on us any second. She looked up, her golden eyes filled with an intensity he hadn't seen before. She placed the artifact in a small satchel slung across her chest, then turned toward him. Her expression spoke volumes they couldn't leave yet. Are you kidding me? Eli snapped, gesturing toward the entrance. We don't have time to stick around and admire the decor. Nyrella walked to the pedestal, her movements calm despite the tremors that rattled the ground. She placed her hands on the carvings, which began to shift and glow under her touch. The room responded, lines of light racing up the walls and connecting to a series of symbols that shimmered like constellations. Eli groaned, running a hand through his hair. I'm guessing this isn't just some fancy light show. Whatever you're doing, make it quick. Nyrella's fingers moved with purpose, activating a sequence of patterns that seemed to hum with an ancient resonance. The air grew heavy, almost alive, as the carvings emitted a low, melodic tone. It wasn't just sound, it was a vibration that resonated in Eli's chest, a sensation he couldn't explain. The entrance to the cavern exploded. Eli ducked instinctively, shielding his face as debris rained down around them. When the dust settled, he saw a squad of syndicate soldiers flooding into the chamber. They wore dark, angular armor that gleamed in the dim light, and their weapons were trained directly on him and Nyrella. Stay where you are, barked their leader, a towering figure with a voice that cut through the chaos like a blade. His helmet obscured his face, but his stance exuded authority. Eli raised his blaster, keeping his body angled to shield Nyrella. You really want to do this? Because I'm not in the mood for company. The leader ignored him, his gaze fixed on Nyrella. Hand over the artifact, and I'll consider letting you live. Nyrella turned slowly, her expression calm but defiant. She didn't need to understand his words to grasp his intent. Her hand hovered near the satchel, as if weighing her options. Eli snorted. Yeah, that sounds real convincing. Let me guess you're gonna spare us. Then toss us out an airlock? We'll pass, thanks. The leader raised his weapon, his patience clearly waning. This isn't a negotiation. Eli smirked, then fired. The blaster bolt struck one of the soldiers, dropping him instantly. The room erupted into chaos as the syndicate opened fire. Eli dove behind the pedestal, returning fire with precision born of years in combat. Nyrella crouched beside him, her hands gripping the satchel tightly. Any ideas? Eli shouted over the cacophony. Nyrella reached into the satchel, pulling out the artifact. Its glow intensified as she held it aloft, her eyes narrowing with concentration. She turned toward the pedestal and placed the artifact into a circular indentation at its center. The chamber responded immediately. Light surged through the carvings, and the melodic hum grew louder, filling the space with a crescendo of energy. The syndicate soldiers hesitated, their weapons faltering as they took in the spectacle. What the hell is she doing? One of them muttered, his voice edged with fear. The leader barked a command, snapping them back into action. Stop her. Eli fired again, taking down another soldier as they advanced. Nyrella, whatever this is, now's the time. The artifact flared, its light blinding as it emitted a wave of energy that rippled outward. The soldiers closest to the pedestal were thrown backward, their armor sparking as the energy shorted their systems. The cavern walls shimmered, and the air grew impossibly still, as if the entire room was holding its breath. When the light subsided, the artifact floated above the pedestal, spinning slowly. Nyrella rose to her feet, her body surrounded by a faint aura. Her eyes glowed brighter than ever, filled with a mix of determination and something Eli couldn't quite place: power. Eli lowered his blaster, staring at her. What just happened? Nyrella turned to him, gesturing toward the exit. The meaning was clear: they had what they needed, but they had to leave now. Fine by me, Eli said, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the exit. The syndicate soldiers who had survived the blast were still recovering, giving them a slim window of escape. Outside the cavern, the desolate planet's surface stretched out before them, a stark contrast to the chaos inside. The freighter sat in the distance, its engines already idling. Eli and Nyrella sprinted toward it, the sound of syndicate reinforcements echoing behind them. As they reached the ship, Eli hit the ramp controls, and it lowered with a hiss. Nyrella darted inside, heading straight for the cockpit while Eli covered their retreat. He fired a few warning shots at the pursuing soldiers before boarding and slamming the controls to seal the ramp. Punch it, he shouted as he raced to the cockpit. Nyrella was already in the pilot's seat, her hands flying across the controls. The freighter lifted off, its engines roaring as it ascended through the planet's thin atmosphere. Plasma fire streaked past them, but the ship held steady, its reinforced hull absorbing the impacts. Eli dropped into the co-pilot's seat, panting. Remind me to stop taking jobs that get me shot at. Nyrella gave him a sidelong glance, her lips curling into the faintest hint of a smile. For a moment the tension lifted, replaced by a fleeting sense of triumph. As the freighter entered hyperspace, Eli leaned back, exhaling slowly. All right, you've got my attention. What's the next move? Nyrella retrieved the artifact from the satchel, holding it up so he could see. The light inside it shifted, forming intricate patterns that seemed almost alive. She pointed to the holographic map, then to a new set of coordinates glowing faintly. Eli frowned. Another stop. You're telling me this isn't over? Nyrella nodded, her gaze steady. She placed her hand over her heart, then gestured outward, as if to say, this is only the beginning. Eli sighed, running a hand through his hair. Of course it is. But as he looked at the artifact, its light pulsing with quiet power, he felt a flicker of something unexpected. Hope. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. And for the first time in a long while, Eli Drake believed they just might stand a chance.